how to ensure garment workers earn a decent living? It sounds like a simple question, but the answer is kind of complicated. Workers are employed by garment factories, and those factories get orders from brands to produce the clothes that end up being sold to you, like this $20 t-shirt. Okay, so this is a little bit of a simplification, but for our current purposes, it'll do the trick. So let's talk about that $20 that you paid the brand for the t-shirt. Some of that money goes to the brand, some of it goes to the factory, and then the factory has to pay some of that to the worker. Making sure workers get a bigger, fairer slice of the pie could play out in a couple of ways. For example, the factory owner could give up some of their piece so that more goes to the worker. But for a lot of factories, this wouldn't be super easy since their profits are usually pretty small. Or maybe the brand pays the supplier a higher price to cover those extra costs. Or maybe the proportions remain the same, but the pie gets bigger because you, the consumer, pay a little more. But how does the pie get sliced up? Who decides how big it is and how much goes to each party? A lot of that gets determined during price negotiations between factories and brands. Well, hang on a minute. Let me introduce myself. That's me. Yep, I used to manage a garment factory in Cambodia, and I agree, garment factory workers should get paid more. The thing is, most of the time my experience at these negotiating tables looked a little more like this, one-sided. Brands told me what price they were willing to pay, and most of the time we had to take it or leave it. Otherwise, they'd take their order somewhere else. So let's talk about that factory slice. Labor costs are just one part of it. When thinking about how to ensure that garment factory workers earn a decent living, a lot of labor rights activists advocate for ring-fencing labor costs. It's like putting a little fence around the factory's labor costs so that during negotiations between brands and factories, the worker's slice is off limits and doesn't get touched. But ring-fencing labor costs, or even negotiating for one of these two scenarios, still wouldn't have been enough to ensure workers get paid a decent living. Why? Well, the cost of worker time per piece sold actually fluctuates a lot. Sometimes, as a factory manager, it cost me this much, then it went up to this much, and then it went back down to that much. Wait, hang on a minute. Aren't worker salaries fixed? Well, sure. In one sense, that worker slice is fixed because the amount paid to workers at the end of the month probably doesn't change that much. Let's say your total payroll for all your production floor workers costs a fixed $8 per month. Say in 1 month you sell 8 pieces. Your total payroll was $8 divided by 8 shirts comes to $1 per piece. Then in the next month you only sell 4 pieces. So your total payroll was still $8 divided by 4 shirts comes to $2 per piece sold. Your labor costs per piece sold have doubled. Nothing within the factory's 4 walls has changed. Nobody has gotten faster or slower. Nobody has been hired or fired. And the price the brand pays the factory per t-shirt is still the same too. Let's say it's $1.50. When your labor cost per piece sold was $1, life was good. But when an unexpected change in order volume brings your labor cost per piece sold up to $2, you're in trouble. When the prices brands pay their factories are so low, unexpected changes in order volume mean you can very quickly go from making money to losing it. And it's these unexpected changes to order volume that impact your bottom line way more than marginal increases in wages or even efficiency gains. So as a factory manager, it really doesn't matter whether you have a lot of orders or just a couple of orders. What matters is that the orders you get more or less match with what you're able to do, your capacity. The challenge that factory managers face is that they don't really know what's going to happen on the order side. And when they have no idea how many orders they're going to get, a workforce that can cheaply and easily expand and contract is a way of coping with uncertainty. Let's go back to the order side of things. Nobody, not the factory and not the brand, has a crystal ball. Nobody can see into the future and see what their sales will look like, right? If everyone's in the same boat, why is it a problem? Well, information flows this way. The brands estimate how many pieces they're going to sell, and they share that information with the factories that produce for them. It's called a forecast. The factory uses that forecast to make irreversible financial decisions about how many people to hire and how much fabric and raw materials to buy, decisions that have to be made a long time before confirmed orders come in. So while the information flows from brands to suppliers, the money flows the other way from suppliers to brands, meaning that when those forecasts inevitably are wrong, it's the factories who pay the price. Remember this balancing act? Since factories have to put up serious money based on uncertain information, it's to their advantage if they can expand and contract their workforce to match their order volume. For workers, this translates into low wages, short-term contracts, and little job security. It also leads to subcontracting, meaning that the factory keeps minimal staff on its own team and hires supporting factories to help them out. That way, they only pay for the capacity for the workers when and if they're needed. Research has shown that workers in subcontracted factories often fare worse, and though it certainly isn't justified, it kind of makes sense. Cheaply flexible labor is the whole reason those subcontracted factories exist in the first place. Remember all those brands that were in the news for canceling orders and refusing to pay for goods already produced at the start of the pandemic? Well, a lot of them still haven't paid. And the reason they haven't paid is actually pretty simple. It didn't, and still doesn't, cost them anything because they haven't had to put up any money for the people who made those products or the raw materials used to make them. It's worth emphasizing that the pandemic wasn't a one-off isolated event. It was just a more extreme version of business as usual. Let's say a brand forecasts that it's going to buy 100 shirts, and those shirts are going to take 100 labor hours to make. The factory has a total of 200 hours available, so it reserves 100 hours for the brand. The other 100 hours go to different orders and different customers. But sales are a little slower than expected that season, so instead of ordering 100 shirts like it planned, the brand only orders 80. That means that although the factory reserved 100 hours for the brand, they only used 80 labor hours, and there were 20 unused hours. So who pays for those unused hours? Well, remember this? Right now, the factory has to cover the difference all by itself, driving up its cost per piece with negative consequences for workers. But what if instead the cost of those 20 unused hours were split? 10 were paid by the brand and 10 were paid by the factory. That's what shared risk means. It means partnership. It means codependence. It means having a vested interest in each other's successes and failures. In practical terms, it means consequences for deviating from forecast, like deposits, or even prices that hinge on consistency relative to forecast. But shared risk isn't just about what's fair, or even just about ensuring workers get paid decent wages. It also changes the incentives for the whole supply chain in really fundamental ways. Remember this? Shared risk means that brands are motivated to keep their suppliers loaded, to help them out with this really tough balancing act between capacity and orders, and not out of the goodness of their hearts, but because idle workers or unused raw materials now cost them too. Remember all those canceled orders? Brands probably would have thought twice about canceling had they had to pay for the people or the materials used to make those goods. As for suppliers, well, had they not had to front the costs of production all by themselves, they might have had a little more cash lying around, meaning that they may have been in a position to take the long-term view. Pushing brands to take on inventory they can't sell ultimately won't help factories either. Meanwhile, a more consistently loaded factory greatly reduces the supplier's incentive to subcontract, to rely on cheaply flexible labor. Other considerations like training and recruitment costs or the high risk of quality defects in subcontracted facilities become more important. If risk were shared, supply chains would also probably be a little shorter, meaning there wouldn't be as much inventory in the system to begin with. Why? Because shorter supply chains mean shorter lead times, and shorter lead times mean reduced forecasting horizons, and reduced forecasting horizons mean more accurate forecasts, and more accurate forecasts mean producing the right products at the right time. Gone is the incentive for brands to cover themselves through over-ordering, which, as my podcast co-host Jessie Lee likes to point out, is the more apt term for overproduction. So shared risk and reward isn't a zero-sum game that only benefits workers and factories at the expense of brands. Shared risk is what makes collaboration and prioritizing long-term collective goals possible. So how do we make sure garment factory workers earn a decent living? Well, they depend on brands sharing in the financial risk of forecast deviations, in the financial risk of uncertainty. Because it's the fact that suppliers disproportionately bear the risk for deviations from forecast that leads to workers being squeezed. So if you want to support garment factory workers to earn a decent living, one part of the solution is changing this. And that means asking the brands you shop from about their purchasing practices, about their forecast, and most importantly, what they do when those forecasts, inevitably, are wrong. If you want to learn more, I've written some articles on this topic. You can check them out on Medium. Or check out the podcast I co-host with Jessie Lee. It's called Manufactured, a podcast featuring supplier voices on sustainable fashion. Available on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.